So this term, we've been looking at tools to go. Like what tools are in our tool bag, if you like, to be able to fulfill Jesus' commandment to us to go into all the world and tell people about him. And over the last few weeks, we've looked at different tools together. We thought about a grafting tool, which was all about being grafted into Jesus, John 15, how we stay close to him. We've looked at how Jesus gives us a tool bag, meaning he gives us all the tools we need whenever we need them. We've looked at the idea of a scythe, because Jesus says the harvest is plentiful. And we looked last week at the idea of a tablecloth, because actually Jesus tells us to gather people, to have meals and show hospitality to others. But this morning, what I want to look at is this idea of a photo album. But I'll come to that in a moment. Now, I wonder what you think the best story ever told is. What's the best book, the best story that you've ever read and come across? Now, I wonder as well whether you have ever thought about your life being made into a story or a movie. In your more self-absorbed moments, whether you've thought, God, I wonder what a movie of my life would look like. Maybe some of you have thought about writing your memoirs. Now, to be honest, perhaps most of us don't quite really think we've got stories worth telling. Perhaps you think you've not really got much of a story to tell. Perhaps you think, well, I'm only 6, so not a lot's happened. Or perhaps you're 86 and you think, well, I've not really got too much of a story to tell. I've lived a fairly normal life. Now, this thing I held up earlier, particularly just for those under the age of 25, it's called a photo album. And it's what, in the olden days, we used to keep and put photos in to remind us as a bit of a record of our lives. In here, and other photo albums I've got at home, a slide's going to come up to give you a little sneak peek. In here is the story... In here is the story of my life. And it's packed full of changes, of transformations. It's got birthdays in there. It's got the different schools I go into. It's got a wealth of different hairstyles, most not to be repeated. It's got different occasions in there, different jobs, my birth of my children, my marriage. It's a story of how I've changed and how I've been transformed. And our Bible reading today, it told us the story of one man, Saul, who was changed and transformed because he met Jesus. He had an encounter with Jesus, and so his story was transformed. Saul had, I'm sure, a life that had already seen lots of changes, but this story we read in Acts 9 is like a massive plot twist in his story. He was going in one direction, he encounters Jesus, and suddenly there's this big plot twist, and his life goes off in a different direction, so much so that he even changes his name. Can anyone remember what he changes his name to? Shout it out. Paul. Saul becomes Paul. You see, an encounter with Jesus can change things. We heard it from Hazel, the story of Hazel. Jesus takes what was, brings about these plot twists, and builds us and transforms us, our story. And in fact, what we begin to realize is that our story, our records of our lives, isn't just actually about our story. But what we begin to realize is that when we encounter Jesus, our story is actually located in God's bigger story. That we're wrapped up and we become a part of God's story, of what God is doing in this world. And that's why Paul's story is in the Bible. Because Paul's story, you see, isn't just really about Paul, but it's about Jesus. That's why Paul goes around and tells everyone his story, but not really to make it about him, but because his story shows something about how amazing Jesus is. I don't know if you've ever thought about your story being part of God's story. Have you ever thought about your story being part of God's story? I don't know if you've ever thought that by sharing your story, actually you're sharing something of God's story, because you're pointing people to how Jesus can bring transformation in their lives. Now, perhaps you don't think you've got much of a story. But if you suddenly start to think, wow, my story is part of God's story, then I don't know about you, but that makes me want to figure out what it is that I can share with others about my story that shows them God's story. And the brilliant thing about this as we go is if we share our story first, think about it, no one can really argue with it because it's my story and it's my experience. And people love hearing stories. And also think about what impacted you. If you're sat here this morning and you're a Christian, what is it that impacted you? Now, for some of you, it might be that Jesus appeared directly to you in a dream, or Jesus spoke to you directly. But I suspect for most of us, myself included, that it was hearing the stories of other people and how Jesus had worked in their lives that made me want to be part of God's story. And so your story, even if it seems small, can actually be really powerful in helping point people to God's story. Just for this last little section, I want to teach you all how you can share your story with your friends, with your family, with your work colleagues. And I want to teach you to do it in 15 seconds. Okay? Are you up for that? It really is. You can learn to tell your story in 15 seconds. So on your seats in front of you, you've got some paper. If you turn over to the side with a cross on it, Vicky, could you just quickly run to the office and get the flip chart for me? Thank you very much. Wonderful. You've got a pen as well. So you want the side with a cross in the middle of the paper facing you. And we're just going to think about our story together. So first of all, when we come to share our story with someone, I want you just to think, and it's written down there, an introduction. There was a time in my life when I was. Just turn to the person next to you and say, there was a time in my life when I was. Okay, well done. Not hard, okay? That's 2 seconds gone already. Okay, nice and easy. Thank you, Vicky. Sorry, I forgot to bring that through. Wonderful. Okay, so that's our intro. There's one in the office with paper on it. Stood by the desks. Sorry, the other flip chart. Okay, so you've got the intro. Now, I want you to think of one or two things that life was like, either before you knew Jesus, or think of a situation, because some of us might have always known Jesus, or think of a situation where stuff was a bit hard, where you were finding stuff a bit tricky. So you might say, there was a time in my life when, for me, I'd say I was lonely and unsure about my life. Okay? But it might be you want to say, there was a time in my life when I was really scared at bedtime at night. Or there's a time in my life when it felt like nobody loved me, I didn't have any friends. Or it might be there was a time in my life when I felt like giving up. Whatever it is for you, just 2 words, so just write those down on those lines. So there was a time in my life when I was, and then just think of 1 word or 2 words of a time when something was a bit tricky or a bit hard, thank you, or you're worried about something. Thanks, Vix. So I'm going to write, there was a time in my life when I was feeling lonely and unsure. And you'll have some other things written down. So that's the first bit. So very quickly, you might just want to turn to your neighbor, turn to your family, turn to someone sitting near to you. And if you'd like, just very quickly practice that bit. There was a time in my life when I was, and then say your 2 words. Okay, very quickly turn to each other. Give that a go. Okay, well done. So that's the first bit. And then we come to the middle bit. Then I met Jesus. You might want to say, then I was forgiven by Jesus. Then I encountered Jesus. Then I knew Jesus. Again, very simply, but if you can't think of anything else, just put, then I met Jesus. So there was a time in my life when I was lonely and unsure. Then I met Jesus, just like Paul did on the Damascus Road. He had an encounter with Jesus. And now, the last bit, I want you to think, what changed? What changed? So for me, there was a time in my life when I was lonely and unsure. Then I met Jesus, and I knew he loved me, and I wanted to serve others. But you might put, if you'd put, you were scared at night, then I met Jesus, and now I know I don't need to be afraid. Or there was a time in my life when I felt like giving up. Then I met Jesus, now I know I have a purpose. Whatever it might be. So just very quickly, if you'd like to, you might want to just share it with someone, you might want to listen to them, but just turn in your family, turn to your neighbor, turn to someone you came with, and very quickly, let's go. But then I met Jesus, and say that last bit, off you go. Okay. And then we're going to finish the whole thing off by finishing with a question, because we want a conversation with people. We don't just want to leave it as us telling them our story. We want to draw them in and hear their story. So we're just going to finish off with a question. Have you got a story like that? Say after me, have you got a story like that? So 15 seconds. There was a time in my life when I was lonely and unsure. Then I met Jesus, and I knew he loved me, and I wanted to spend my life serving others. Do you have a story like that? Under 15 seconds. Just a way of quickly sharing our story. And this is a really easy tool, an easy model to use. This tool is being used in India to reach thousands and thousands of people each day. So it's a tool, apparently, that even an 8-year-old can, not even an 8-year-old, that an 8-year-old can learn. So, very quickly, last little thing. Turn to your neighbor again, turn to someone behind you, in front of you. One of you might want to go, one of you might want to listen, but just try and go through the whole thing all together. So imagine someone's just said to you, oh, you go to church. Why do you follow Jesus? What would you say? Go. Okay, I know you've probably not all got to the end. If you're 25 seconds, Jacob, you need to be a bit more concise. It's fine. Wonderful. So one of the tools that we have to go is our story. And when we share our story, it can point to the story of Jesus. If you don't feel you've got a story yet, if you're not a Christian, that's fine. I'd suggest you've still got a story, and God is still at work in your life. And maybe you just need a bit of help finding that story, which we'd love to do and chat to you about after the service. But we're going to stand together. We're going to pray. We're going to be encouraged that we each have a story. And then we're going to sing together as well. So hope you come, Jacob.